The second fireplace was already burning when Lucy Garner stepped through the door. That was the first thing she noticed, before she noticed the rough-hewn walls or the elk skull mounted above the mantel, or the smell of pine resin and wood smoke that clung to every surface of the cabin like a second skin. Two fireplaces, one on the north wall, crackling with a steady, confident flame. One on the south wall, smaller, more carefully constructed, its mortar still pale and clean, its hearthstone swept to a precision that made the rest of the cabin look almost careless by comparison. The south one was burning too, laid with cedar and something that smelled faintly of dried lavender. Of all things, in the middle of the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1874. Lucy stood in the doorway with her traveling bag in her hand, and the cold October wind pushing at her back, and she said absolutely nothing for a long moment. Then she turned to the man standing near the north fireplace, watching her with an expression she could not yet read, this tall, broad-shouldered stranger with dark eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same sandstone as the canyon walls outside. Wesley Bristol, the man she had agreed to correspond with for 6 months. The man she had not agreed to marry. The man who had written her 22 letters, each one more careful and considered than the last, each one stopping precisely short of a formal proposal, as though he were building something one brick at a time and did not want to rush the mortar. The man who had, apparently, built a second fireplace. Who is that one for? She asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a small miracle given that her heart was hammering against her ribs like it was trying to get out. Wesley Bristol did not answer right away. He looked at the south fireplace. He looked back at her. Something moved through those dark eyes, something careful and hidden and enormous, and for one terrible, suspended second Lucy had the absolute conviction that the answer was going to destroy her. She had traveled 900 miles on 3 different trains and a wagon to get here. She had left behind a life in St. Louis that was small and safe and slowly suffocating her. She had told exactly one person where she was going, her friend Clara, who had gripped her hand at the station and said, "Lucy Garner, if that man turns out to be a villain, I will personally come out west and shoot him." And Lucy had laughed and said she was sure it would be fine. Standing in the doorway of this cabin now, looking at a fireplace that had not existed in any of Wesley Bristol's 22 letters, she was somewhat less certain. "It is for you," he said finally, "if you want it." The words landed in the room like something dropped from a great height. "If I want it," she repeated. "You never agreed to come," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite an apology and not quite a defense, something raw and unguarded that she had not expected from a man who presented as solidly and immovably as a mountain range. "I wrote you that letter in August. I told you about the ranch, the land, the work. I told you I thought you might be someone who could make a life here. I did not ask you to come. I was not certain you would." He paused. "But I started building it anyway." Lucy stared at him. "Why?" "Because I wanted you to have something that was yours," he said. "Not mine that you were being let into. Yours, a place in this house that nobody built for themselves before you arrived." The wind pushed harder at Lucy's back. She had not moved from the doorway. Her bag was still in her hand. The south fireplace crackled and sent a breath of warm cedar air across the room toward her, and she thought, with a clarity that frightened her slightly, that it was the most deliberately kind thing anyone had ever done for her in 26 years of living. She stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her. She did not say yes, not yet, but she did not leave, and that, as it turned out, was where everything began. 6 months earlier, Lucy Garner had been sitting in the back office of Hargrove and Sons Mercantile on Delmer Boulevard in St. Louis, doing sums in a ledger that was not her ledger, in a life that felt increasingly like it had been designed by someone else for someone else, and she had simply been assigned to it at birth without being consulted. She was 26 years old. She had been employed by Hargrove and Sons for 4 years, since the death of her mother had left her with no income and a rented room she needed to keep. She was good at the work, quick with figures, reliable with inventory, possessed of a handwriting that Mr. Hargrove Sr. described as exceptionally legible, which was the highest praise she had ever received from him. She had a small circle of friends, a church she attended more out of habit than conviction, a Sunday afternoon ritual of walking along the riverfront with Clara Simmons, who was engaged to a perfectly decent cotton broker named Frederick and who was deeply, earnestly worried about Lucy's future. "You need to consider your options," Clara had said the previous Sunday as they watched a steamboat work its way up the Mississippi. "You are 26, Lucy. You are not getting younger." "Thank you for the information," Lucy said. "I am serious. Frederick has a friend, a Mr. Alderman, who is— No, you have not even met him. I do not need to meet him. His name is Mr. Alderman, and he is one of Frederick's friends, which means he is approximately 50 years old and has opinions about tariffs." Clara had laughed despite herself and then looked worried again. "What are you going to do then?" That was the question. Lucy did not have a good answer for it. She had a competent answer, which was that she would continue working at Hargrove and Sons until she had saved enough money to perhaps open a small business of her own, a millinery or a boarding house or something of that sort. But it was the kind of answer that felt thin and provisional, like paper stretched over a frame, adequate as long as you did not press on it. The advertisement had come to her attention 3 weeks later, through a roundabout path that involved Clara's neighbor Mrs. Beckworth, who had a cousin in Cheyenne, who knew a woman in Casper, who had received a letter from a rancher named Wesley Bristol asking if she knew any women of good character and reasonable fortitude who might be interested in correspondence with a view toward partnership, specifically a woman who was not afraid of open country and who had some practical skill, and who was, above all, looking for a life that was actually hers. That last phrase was what got to Lucy, a life that was actually hers. It came to her second-hand through Mrs. Beckworth and Clara over a cup of tea, but it landed like a key in a lock she had not known was there. "You cannot be serious," Clara said. "I am only writing a letter," Lucy said. "People write letters. To strangers in Wyoming. To ranchers in Wyoming. There is a distinction." There was not much of a distinction, as it turned out, but by the time Lucy had written and received her first reply, she did not particularly care. Wesley Bristol wrote the way she had not expected a Wyoming rancher to write. He wrote carefully, with attention to specificity, describing the land around his property in the foothills east of the Laramie Mountains, with the kind of precision that told her he had looked at it hard and loved it harder. He wrote about his horses, about a mare named Patience who had an opinion about everything, and communicated it through ear position. He wrote about the loneliness of the Territory winters, not with self-pity but with a kind of plain honesty that she found more compelling than any amount of practiced charm. He did not write about his past. That was something she noticed early, a careful blankness around anything that preceded his arrival in Wyoming 5 years ago. He had come from somewhere. He had become something before he was this rancher with his 200 acres and his 4 horses and his honest letters. But he did not say from where, or what, or why the gap existed between whoever he had been and whoever he was now. Lucy had her own gaps. She did not press on his. Their correspondence had continued through the spring and summer of 1874 with a regularity and a depth that she had not anticipated. By June she was writing him twice a week. By July she had told him things she had told almost no one, about her mother's long illness and the particular loneliness of being a caretaker at 22, about the way sent. Louis felt to her like a beautiful box she was trapped inside, about the small private ambitions she had carried so long in silence that they had started to feel like secrets, the desire to have land, to have something permanent and hers, to not be, as she put it in one letter that she almost did not send, perpetually a guest in someone else's life. He had written back, "I know exactly what you mean by that. Come and see if this is the kind of life that could be yours." He had not asked her to marry him. He had invited her to come and see. She had read the letter 4 times, noted the careful, respectful distance it maintained, and spent a week deciding whether to be reassured by that distance or unnerved by it. In the end, she had bought a train ticket to Cheyenne. She had written to tell him she was coming. She had not written to say she was coming to stay. And now here she was, standing inside a cabin in the foothills of the Laramie Mountains on the 4th of October, 1874, with a second fireplace burning cedar and lavender on the south wall, and a man watching her with those careful, impossible-to-read dark eyes, waiting. "I would like to sit down," Lucy said. "Of course." He moved immediately, pulling a chair close to the south fireplace, because of course he did, because apparently Wesley Bristol did things like that without being asked, small comprehensive acts of consideration that she was going to have to learn to absorb without her heart doing what it was currently doing. She sat. She set her bag down. She looked at the fireplace. It was beautifully built. She knew enough about construction from years of listening to her father before he left to recognize good work. The hearthstone was flat and true. The mortar between the river stones was even and clean. The firebox was the right proportion, not too deep, not too shallow, designed to throw heat into a room rather than suck it up a chimney. It had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and had thought hard about what it was for. "How long did it take you?" she asked. 3 weeks, he said. He was still standing, she noticed, keeping a careful distance, not crowding her. "I started it the day after I sent you the letter in August." Before I replied, "Yes, you did not know I would come." "No," he said, "I did not know." She looked up at him. "Was that wise?" The corner of his mouth moved slightly. It was not quite a smile, but it was the scaffolding of one. "Probably not," he said, "but I have found that waiting until you know for certain whether something is wise before you begin it means you never begin anything." Lucy thought about that. She thought about the train ticket she had bought before she had entirely decided to use it. What if I had not come? "Then it would have been a very nice fireplace that I sat alone beside," he said, and there was something in the straightforwardness of it, the complete absence of drama or self-pity, that made her chest do something complicated. "That is either the most practical or the most romantic answer I have ever heard," she said. "I was not attempting romance," he said, and then paused. "Although I am told I am not particularly skilled at recognizing when I am." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came up from somewhere genuine, not polite or social but actual, and it changed the quality of the air in the cabin in a way that she felt in her sternum. He smiled then, a real one, and it transformed him. He had a good face when he was serious, strong and symmetrical and reliable looking, but when he smiled it became something else entirely, something warm and a little unguarded, and Lucy thought, looking at it, that she was in a great deal of trouble. She had not agreed to come. She had come anyway. He had not asked her to stay. He had built her a fireplace. She looked back at the south wall and decided that this was, in fact, where her life was going to happen. She did not say it yet. She was not the sort of woman who said things like that out loud until she had examined them from every angle and confirmed they were true. But she knew it, sitting beside the cedar fire in the hearthstone warmth of a fireplace built for her before she had agreed to exist in this place, and the knowing settled into her bones like heat into cold rock, slow and complete and permanent. The next morning came gray and cold, with a frost that had crept in overnight and turned every surface to silver. Lucy woke in the small room at the back of the cabin that Wesley had prepared for her, which had a real bed with a wool blanket, and a window that faced east so the first light came straight in, and she lay still for a moment listening to the sounds of the territory. A hawk somewhere, wind in what she would learn were the cottonwood trees along the creek, and from the other side of the cabin wall, the quiet, methodical sounds of a man who had been up for an hour already and was building a fire. The north one, she noted, when she came out wrapped in her shawl. The south fireplace was not lit. He was kneeling at the north hearth, adding wood, and he turned when he heard her and said, "Good morning," with a directness that had no performance in it at all, and she realized she had been braced for awkwardness, the particular awkwardness of two strangers who have been intimate on paper suddenly having to be physical people in a shared space, and it was not there. He was simply himself, the same as he had been in the letters. "Good morning," she said. "I would like to see the land." He looked at her for a second, and then something that might have been relief or satisfaction moved through his expression and was gone. "After breakfast," he said, "she could cook." That was not a small thing out here, and she could tell from the way he accepted her move toward the cast-iron skillet without comment that he had noted it, filed it, valued it without making a production of it. They made breakfast together in the efficient, minimal way of two people who are both competent and do not need to narrate their competence, and it was easy in a way that made her feel as though something very large had been decided very quietly. The land was extraordinary. She had expected it to be beautiful because his letters had described it beautifully. But beauty described and beauty witnessed are different countries, and standing in the thin October sunlight on the ridge above his property, looking west toward the Laramie Mountains rising blue and enormous against the sky, south toward the flat golden expanse of the high plains, north along the creek bottom where the cottonwoods had gone yellow, she felt something inside her chest open up like a door she had not known was closed. "It floods in spring," he said, pointing to the low ground along the creek. "The lower pasture goes under for about 3 weeks. The horses have to be moved to the upper ground." "Where?" He showed her. He showed her everything, walking beside her with the natural, unhurried stride of a man who had covered this ground 10,000 times and could read it like text, the places where the soil changed and the grass grew thick, the rocky outcropping on the east side where he said mountain lions sometimes came in winter to watch the horses, the south-facing slope he was thinking of clearing for a kitchen garden in the spring. "In the spring," she said, noting the assumption. He glanced at her. "If you are here," he said, acknowledging it. "I have not agreed to stay," she said. "No," he said, "you have not." They walked in silence for a moment. Below them, one of his horses, a large red roan, moved along the fence line with the purposeful air of an animal that knew it was being watched. "Which one is Patience?" Lucy asked. "The gray mare there by the water trough." He pointed to a smaller horse standing very still at the far end of the paddock, ears up, watching them with an expression of deep personal judgment. "She has already decided something about you. Good or bad? Undetermined," he said. "She takes time." Lucy looked at the gray mare with her evaluating ears and thought, "We have something in common." Over the following days, a rhythm emerged between them that felt less like the careful choreography of two strangers finding their footing, and more like the rediscovery of a rhythm that had always existed, as though the 6 months of letters had been them learning each other in a key they could now play in person without needing to sight read. She helped with the work of the ranch. There was a great deal of it. Wesley ran a small cattle operation, 32 head, along with the horses, and the work of maintaining a Wyoming ranch heading into winter was relentless and physical and deeply, satisfyingly concrete. Lucy found that she liked physical work in a way she had never had the opportunity to discover in St. Louis, the way it emptied her mind and asked everything of her body, and left her at the end of the day tired in a manner that felt honest. She also discovered, on the third day, what lay beneath the careful blankness in his letters. She had gone to the small barn to find a spare lantern and had found instead, on a shelf behind a horse blanket, a tin box that had been pushed back and not quite hidden, and she had not opened it. She was not someone who opened other people's tin boxes, but she had seen the corner of what was inside when the blanket slipped, and it was a badge. A U.S. Marshal's badge, tarnished and old. She said nothing about it, but it sat in the back of her mind all day rearranging things. That evening after supper, they sat by the south fireplace, which had become by unspoken agreement their fireplace, the north one for cooking and morning warmth, the south one for evenings, for the longer conversations that unreeled with the natural ease of their letters, but with the additional weight and warmth of physical presence. "You were a lawman," she said. He went still in the way a large, quiet animal goes still when something unexpected moves nearby. Then he let out a slow breath and said, "Yes, U.S. Marshal, deputy for 3 years. Then Marshal for 2. Where? Kansas," he said. Abilene, then Dodge City. She knew what those names meant. Everyone in America by 1874 knew what those names meant. Cattle towns, trail ends, places where the violence of the frontier concentrated and exploded with a regularity that made them famous in the way that disasters are famous. "Why did you stop?" she asked. He looked at the fire. "I shot a man," he said, "in the line of duty. It was legal and it was justified and it was the right call under every definition of right that applied in that situation." He paused. He had a son, 17 years old, watching from the boardwalk. That boy looked at me afterward with something in his face that I have not been able to forget. Another pause. I decided I had done enough of that kind of work. Lucy was quiet for a moment. "How long ago was this?" 5 years, he said. "I came out here, filed on a homestead, built the cabin, bought the cattle." He looked at her then directly. "I left it out of the letters because I did not know how to write it, and because I was not certain you would come if you knew." "You thought it would frighten me away," she said. "Or put me in a different category than I wanted to be in," he said. She considered that. "What category were you afraid of?" "Dangerous," he said. "Violent, complicated." He said it plainly, without drama, but she could hear the weight in it, the years of carrying something that had no clean resolution. "Were you those things?" she asked. "I was the law in Dodge City in 1869, he said. "You could not be any of those things part of the time. You had to be them every day or the men who were them worse would run you over." He met her eyes. "I am not those things now. I have spent 5 years making sure of it." She believed him. She did not know entirely why she believed him, except that she had now spent 4 days watching him move through the world with a gentleness that was not weakness, but rather the gentleness of a man who understood exactly what he was capable of and had chosen with full knowledge and clear intention to be something else. That is a different thing from a man who is gentle because he has never had to be otherwise. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said immediately. "I should have. I am sorry." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, jaw tight, waiting for whatever judgment she was going to make, and she thought about the second fireplace, about the letter in August that had said come and see, about 22 careful letters that had given her the real shape of a man's daily life and thinking while protecting this one secret, and she decided that the architecture of trust was built one stone at a time, and this was simply a stone that had been placed late. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right." "You told me now," she said. "You told me without my having to keep pushing. That counts for something." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was learning to read, the one that meant he was feeling something large and was deciding how much of it to show. "You are a very fair person, Lucy Garner," he said. "I try to be," she said. "I am also not finished with you on this topic, but I am finished for tonight." He smiled, and there it was again, that transformation, and she turned back to the fire before she did something precipitate. The town of Millhaven was 12 miles east, at the edge of the high plains where the land flattened out, and a cluster of buildings had assembled themselves around a water tower and a general store with the provisional permanence of all frontier towns, as though they were still deciding whether to stay. Wesley took her there on the 6th day in the wagon to get supplies and, she suspected, to give her a sense of what community existed out here. It was a small town of perhaps 200 people, with the usual arrangement of those years. A general store run by a man named Elias Morrow who had an excellent memory for faces and an uncertain relationship with the concept of fixed pricing, a blacksmith, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a saloon, and a handful of modest residences. There was also a land office that Lucy noted with interest. She was aware, walking through Millhaven beside Wesley, of being looked at. Not unkindly, but with the frank curiosity of a small community that knew everyone's business and was actively updating its records. Several people greeted Wesley with the warm, slightly reserved respect given to a man who had been part of a community long enough to be trusted, but perhaps not long enough to have no mystery left about him. He introduced her as Miss Garner, A friend visiting from St. Louis, which was technically accurate, and she appreciated the discretion. In the general store, she met a woman named Harriet Keel, who ran the post office that operated out of one corner of Morrow's store, and who looked at Lucy with sharp, kind eyes and said, "You are the woman from the letters." "Harriet," Wesley said, with a warning note. "Oh, be quiet, Wesley, everybody knows," Harriet said serenely. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and the hands of someone who had done decades of hard work and wore it like a credential. "We have been watching him build that south wall for 3 weeks, Miss Garner. You have been a topic of considerable interest." Lucy looked at Wesley, who was examining a display of harness hardware with extreme focus. "Have I?" she said. "He does not talk about personal things," Harriet said, "which means when he does something personal, everyone notices." Building a second fireplace is personal. She folded her hands on the counter. "Are you staying?" "I have not decided," Lucy said, and felt rather than saw Wesley go still at the harness rack. "Well," Harriet said, "I hope you will. We are short on women with good sense out here. It is an ongoing crisis." She said it so matter-of-factly that Lucy laughed and Harriet smiled, satisfied, and went back to sorting mail. On the way back, the wagon rolling through the gold and brown of the October prairie, Lucy said, "Everyone in that town knows about the fireplace." "Yes," he said, not looking away from the horses. "That must have been a risk for you," she said. "Doing something that visible before you knew if I was coming." He was quiet for a moment. "I have spent a long time," he said, "being careful, calculating odds, making sure of things before I committed to them." He watched the lead horse, a big bay named Calhoun, pick his way along the rutted track. "I decided that was no way to build a life. I built the fireplace. If you came, it would be there. If you did not come, I had still done something real." Lucy watched the mountains, which were catching the late afternoon light and burning gold and amber and a deep, aching blue in the shadows. "That is a very brave position," she said. "Or a very foolish one," he said. "Sometimes they are the same thing," she said. He looked at her then sideways with that almost smile. "Sometimes they are." The crisis, when it came, arrived on a Tuesday. Lucy had been at the ranch for 11 days. She had not agreed to stay and she had not left, and the liminal quality of this arrangement was something she felt constantly, a suspended note waiting to resolve. But she was not yet certain enough to resolve it, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that her uncertainty was not about the land or the work or the life available here. It was about him, or more precisely, it was about the hidden current she felt between them every time they were in the same room, the thing that was too large and too serious to rush and too real to ignore. On that Tuesday morning, while Wesley was out checking the east fence line, a rider came to the cabin. Lucy heard the horse before she saw it and went to the door, and the man who dismounted was not someone she had ever seen but was clearly, from his bearing, someone who considered himself important. He was perhaps 40, weathered and broad, with a drooping mustache and the kind of eyes that assessed everything as a potential asset or obstacle. He wore a coat that had been expensive once. "Morning," he said, and it was not friendly. "This is the Bristol place." "It is," she said. He looked her over with the unsubtle evaluation of a man who sorted everyone into categories before the conversation started. "Who are you?" "I might ask you the same," she said. Something moved in his face, not quite amusement. "Name's Goddard, Owen Goddard. I own the Crossbar Ranch north of here." He paused. "Bristol's been cutting my fence line." "I am not aware of that," Lucy said. "Well, you would not be," he said, "but he has 3 sections east side where his property line runs up against my southern pasture." He looked past her at the cabin, then back at her. "I have been patient about it. I am no longer patient." "You should speak to Mr. Bristol directly," she said. "He will be back by midday." "I will do that," he said, and his eyes moved to the south wall of the cabin, which was visible from where he stood, the clean new mortar pale against the older logs, the new chimney rising neat and deliberate above the roofline. Something shifted in his expression that she could not fully read. "Looks like he has been busy." "He has," she said evenly. Goddard looked at her for another moment. "You planning on staying?" It was an intrusive question and they both knew it. "Goodbye, Mr. Goddard," she said and closed the door. She stood inside with her heart beating fast, not from fear exactly but from something adjacent to it, the instinct that this man was going to be a problem in ways that went beyond fence lines. There was something in the way he had looked at the new chimney that she did not like, a calculation in it, a measuring. She was right. Over the next hour, sitting with the south fireplace burning steadily and her mind working, she thought through what she knew about Western land disputes, which was more than most people because she had read everything she could find about the territory before coming here, and the picture that assembled itself was not comfortable. Wesley's property sat in a position that would be very useful to a man trying to expand a ranching operation northward. The creek ran through it. The south-facing slope was the best grazing land for 20 miles. If someone wanted to make his situation difficult enough that he would consider selling at a reduced price, cutting fence accusations that forced legal disputes and ate up a man's time and money would be one way to do it. When Wesley came back at noon and she told him about Goddard's visit, she watched his face carefully. What she saw was not surprise. "He has been trying to buy this land since my second year here," he said, putting down his gloves. "I have declined 3 times. And the fence accusations." He was quiet for a moment. "I have never cut his fence. I have also never been able to prove that he is cutting his own fence and blaming it on me, which is what I believe is happening." "Has he taken it to the law?" "The county sheriff is a man named Pryor," Wesley said. "He and Goddard have known each other for 20 years. He said it without inflection, but the inflection was in what he did not say. Lucy sat with this for a moment. "You were a U.S. Marshal," she said. "Former," he said. "I have no jurisdiction here." "You have connections," she said. "Other marshals, people in the federal system." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something sharp and intent behind the usual steadiness. "You are thinking about this as a legal problem." "Because it is," she said. "It is a property rights problem and a corrupt law enforcement problem, and it has a paper solution. You need documentation, survey records, fence line records, witness accounts of the actual line positions. You need to go above the county level." "There is a federal land office in Cheyenne," he said slowly. "There is," she said, "and you have the kind of history that gets those offices to take you seriously when you walk in." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "You have been here 11 days, he said. 11 days, she agreed. "And I think you have been fighting this on the wrong ground. You have been defensive when you should have been offensive. You have been waiting for him to make a move you can counter when you should have been building a record that takes the ground out from under him." He sat down at the table. He put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them, and she could see him thinking, rearranging, reconsidering. "You have a very strategic mind," he said. "I spent 4 years doing books for a mercantile," she said. "You learn that the real fight is never about the number on the page. It is about who controls the narrative of how that number got there." He looked up at her, and there was something new in his eyes, something that was admiration but also more than admiration, something that felt like recognition, like he was seeing a piece of something he had been looking for and had not known the exact shape of until this moment. "Lucy," he said, and the way he said her name for the first time without the formal Miss Garner was like a door opening. "Yes," she said. "I would like you to stay," he said. "Not because I need help with Goddard, though I will clearly take it. Because I have been alone in this cabin and on this land for 5 years, and I have been, I think, good at being alone, but I am better with you here. I am smarter and warmer and more of whatever I actually want to be." He held her gaze. "I am asking. I know I have not asked before. I am asking now." The south fireplace burned cedar and lavender behind her. The Laramie Mountains stood blue and enormous in the west. The gray mare Patience was visible through the window, her ears in a position that Lucy had been learning to read, and they were, for the first time since her arrival, pointed forward with interest rather than sideways with judgment. "I will stay through the winter," Lucy said. "And then we will discuss what comes next." It was not yes to everything. She was not going to say yes to everything on day 11, but he accepted it with such genuine, uncomplicated gratitude that she had to look away before she said something she was not ready to say. "Thank you," he said simply. "Write a letter to your contact at the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne tomorrow," she said, because she was a practical woman and the moment felt like it was becoming too large, and she needed something concrete to do with it. "I will help you draft it." "All right," he said, smiling. "And the South Fireplace is mine," she said. "I want that established clearly." "It has been yours since the first brick," he said. She went to bed that night thinking that 11 days was not very long to know a person, and that she had known this man for considerably longer than 11 days, and that the distinction between knowing and understanding was one that the letters had begun to collapse, and the last 11 days had finished collapsing entirely. The letter to Cheyenne was written and sent. The response came back in 10 days, which was fast for the Postal Service in Wyoming in 1874, and it came with the name of a federal land commissioner named Hugh Aldgate, who was willing to conduct an on-site survey of the disputed boundary lines, which was exactly what Wesley needed. In the meantime, Lucy had decided that the kitchen garden slope was not going to wait until spring in terms of planning, and she had begun staking it out and drawing diagrams and making lists of seeds she would need to order through Morrow's store by March. And Wesley had watched this process with an expression of such open delight that she had finally said, "What?" And he had said, "You plan things the way I build things, exact and thorough and one step ahead of where you actually are." She considered this. "Is that a good thing?" "It is the best thing," he said. The Goddard situation escalated before it resolved, as these things do. He sent 2 of his ranch hands to cut 3 sections of fence on the east boundary in broad daylight, apparently having decided that subtlety was no longer serving him. And when Wesley rode out to repair it, the ranch hands were still there, waiting. And there were words exchanged that Lucy heard about secondhand because she had not been there, having been in town with Harriet Keel that afternoon getting the letter off to the seed supplier. What she came home to was Wesley at the north fireplace with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup and a cut above his eyebrow that was already bruising, and Patience the gray mare in the paddock with her ears absolutely flat, which Lucy had learned meant fury. "Tell me what happened," Lucy said. He told her. The ranch hands had not been content with words. One of them had thrown the first blow, which he had absorbed, and then responded to with the controlled precision of a man who had once kept order in Dodge City and had not entirely forgotten how. Nobody was permanently damaged. But it was going to get back to Goddard, and Goddard was going to use it, and the county sheriff Pryor was going to side with Goddard, and without the federal survey happening first, Wesley was going to end up on the wrong side of whatever legal action came next. "How long until the federal commissioner gets here?" she asked. "He said 3 weeks, Wesley said. "Is there anything that can go badly in 3 weeks? He looked at her steadily. "There is always something that can go badly in 3 weeks. She sat down across the table from him. "Then we document everything. Today, tonight. Every fence line, every incident, every date and time. We write it all down and we get witnesses to sign it." Harriet Keel would sign. Who else in town? "Elias Morrow," he said. "The blacksmith Theo Pryor, no relation to the sheriff. Dr. Calloway, who has set 2 of Goddard's hands broken bones and has opinions about him." "Good," she said. "Tomorrow we go to town and we get signatures." He looked at the cut above his eyebrow. "You are not going to ask how my head is." "I can see how your head is," she said, standing back up and going to the cupboard where she had, over the past 3 weeks, reorganized things enough to know where the clean linen was. "It is going to be a very distinguished bruise." She came back with a damp cloth and held it out to him. He took it and their fingers touched briefly in the transfer, and neither of them said anything about that, but neither of them moved immediately either, and the south fireplace burned on the wall between them and the cabin was warm and the mountains outside were going dark under a sky full of cold stars. "Lucy," he said quietly. "Document first," she said. "Everything else second." He nodded, accepting this, but his eyes said something that she carried through the evening's work and into sleep and woke with still present, warm and certain, and very quietly frightening in the way that things you truly want are frightening. The days that followed were busy in the productive way that she was coming to recognize as the specific texture of life on this ranch, full of work that mattered and conversation that ranged widely, that crossed from the practical to the philosophical without warning, that treated her thinking as a resource and her opinions as worth contending with rather than accommodating. She learned the horses. Patience remained reserved but had begun to allow Lucy close enough to touch her nose, which Wesley said was a significant diplomatic breakthrough. Calhoun the Bay was magnificent and knew it. There were two others, a brown gelding named Major who was tireless and opinionless, and a young black mare called November who had been born in that month the previous year and was still figuring out what she was. She learned the land through all weathers. October turned to November with a cold snap that dropped a foot of snow in 3 days and buried the south-facing slope she had been planning in white. She learned that the light in Wyoming in November had a quality unlike any light she had seen in her life, low and gold and immensely clear, making everything look more real than reality, more itself. She learned Wesley. This was the most interesting and most complicated education. She learned that he was up before dawn every morning not from discipline, but because he genuinely preferred those hours, the dark into gray transition when the ranch was quiet and the thinking was clear. She learned that he read, which she had known from the letters, but seeing the shelf of books above the north fireplace gave it a different character, worn spines of Thoreau and Emerson, and a battered copy of Hugo's Les Miserables in English translation that he had clearly read multiple times. She learned that he could be funny, dryly and suddenly, in a way that caught her off guard every time. She learned that when he was worried he went quiet in a particular way that was different from his ordinary quiet, a sort of compression, and that she had developed the ability to recognize it and had developed, also, the instinct to sit near him when she recognized it, not to press him into talking, but to simply be close, and that this seemed to help. She learned that he looked at her differently after the conversation about his past and her response to it. Not differently in kind, but differently in degree. The careful guard that had been present in the early days, the slight distance he maintained as though managing the risk of proximity, had been slowly lowering, and she watched it lower and felt her own lower in response. On the 14th of November, 6 weeks after her arrival, the federal land commissioner Hugh Aldgate arrived in Millhaven with a surveyor's team and a letter of federal authority that made County Sheriff Pryor look uncomfortable for the first time in what was reportedly a considerable number of years. The survey took 2 days. Lucy went out with Wesley to watch, because she had helped draft the documentation and she had helped organize the witnesses, and she had, in several late evening conversations, talked through the legal strategy with a clarity that Aldgate, when he met her, regarded with evident surprise. "Your wife," he said to Wesley, with the casual assumption of the era. "Miss Garner," Wesley said, with a precision that acknowledged the question without correcting the assumption in a way that would have required explanations neither of them had made yet. Lucy said nothing, but noted that Wesley had said nothing either to confirm the assumption, which was a different kind of nothing than she had expected. The survey confirmed exactly what Wesley had said. His fence line was entirely within his own property. The sections that had been cut were on his side of the boundary. The damage had been done from outside, as evidenced by the direction of the cuts and the position of the wire ends. Goddard, presented with this finding, attempted 3 different arguments over the course of 2 days, each less convincing than the last, and by the time Aldgate was done, he had been formally warned in a federal document that any further encroachment on or interference with Wesley Bristol's property would result in federal legal proceedings. Pryor, watching this from the margins of his own irrelevance, managed to look simultaneously aggrieved and relieved. The evening after Aldgate and his team rode out, Wesley and Lucy sat by the south fireplace as they had every evening, and the relief in the room was a palpable thing, warm and slightly unwinding, like tension going out of a rope. "It is not over," Wesley said. "Goddard will find another way." "He will always be out there," Lucy agreed. "But you have a federal record now. He knows it. Every step he takes is going to cost him more than it costs you." He nodded and then was quiet for a moment. "I would not have thought of going to Cheyenne," he said. "Not like that. Not as an offensive move." "You would have eventually," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but it would have taken me longer and done more damage first." She looked at the fire. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the spring." He went very still. "The kitchen garden slope," she said. "I want to put in more than vegetables. I want fruit trees, apple trees, maybe pear. They take 5 years to bear properly, but that seems like a good kind of planning." She paused. "That is the kind of planning you do when you intend to stay somewhere." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with the sound of cold water. "Lucy," he said. "I am telling you that I intend to stay," she said. "Permanently. I am not proposing anything formal tonight because I think that conversation deserves more than a declaration beside a fireplace, but I want you to know that the deciding is done. I am staying." Wesley was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, open and unguarded in a way that the marshal's trained stillness usually prevented, and it was the most naked and real she had seen him look, and it was the most real she had ever felt in a room with another person. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she agreed. "I am going to ask you formally," he said, "when you are ready." "I know," she said. "You will know it when I am doing it," he said. "I will be very clear," she smiled. "I appreciate that." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first deliberate, unhurried physical gesture he had made toward her since her arrival, not the brief finger touch over the linen cloth or the accidental proximity of shared work, but a real and intentional taking of her hand in both of his, and it was warm and certain, and she felt it all the way up her arm and into her chest, and she left her hand there because she wanted to, and because it was exactly right. "I am glad you came," he said. "I am glad you built the fireplace before I did," she said. He looked at her with that full smile again. "I was not certain you would see it that way. It is the first thing that told me who you actually were," she said. "Not the letters, though the letters were good, the fireplace. The fact that you committed to something real and visible and impossible to take back before you knew how it was going to turn out." She looked at it, the south wall, the clean hearthstone, the fire they had been feeding together for 6 weeks. "That told me everything important." December in Wyoming was not gentle. It descended on the ranch with a seriousness that was educational and somewhat humbling. Temperatures that dropped to things she had not thought were temperatures a person could function in. Winds off the mountains that had a personal quality to them. Snow that came with the absolute commitment of something that had no interest in your schedule or preferences. Lucy found that she loved it. She had not expected this. She had expected to tolerate the winter, to find it difficult, and to manage it because she was not someone who was deterred by difficulty. Instead, she found that there was a beauty to the deep Wyoming winter that was almost aggressive. The way the cold clarified everything. The way the snow simplified the landscape down to its essential lines. The way the storms that came through were enormous and impersonal, and made the warmth of the cabin feel like a deliberate choice, an act of will against the indifference of the world. She and Wesley were inside together a great deal in December, which could have produced friction, but instead produced something closer to the gradual, comfortable deepening of a bond that had been forming since the first letter. They talked more than she had talked to anyone in years, about everything. Land and law and books and childhood and faith, and the country's complicated, wounded, still unresolved history with the Sioux and Cheyenne nations whose unceded lands they were, after all, occupying, which was a conversation Wesley engaged with more directly and less comfortably than most men of his position would have, a fact she respected. He had, during his martial years, dealt with the violence of that history at its sharpest edge, and he carried no illusions about it. They talked about Clara, about the cotton broker Frederick, about the letters they had exchanged, and what they had said and meant. There were evenings of reading by the south fireplace, comfortable and quiet. There were evenings of elaborate arguments about things that mattered and things that did not, conducted with the pleasure of two people who were well matched in intelligence, and well enough matched in temperament that argument was a form of enjoyment rather than conflict. On the 22nd of December, Wesley made her dinner. Not the ordinary practical cooking they did together, but an actual dinner, a real meal with the good china that she had discovered in a crate under the bed in the back room, and assumed was his mother's, with candles and what turned out to be a bottle of wine he had been keeping for an occasion, and the cabin lit and warm and transformed from a working ranch house into something that was, unmistakably, a celebration. She came in from checking on the horses, which had become her evening responsibility, and she took it seriously, and stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at all of this with an expression she could feel on her face that she suspected gave away a great deal. "Sit down," he said from the kitchen end of the room. "Dinner is almost ready." "What are we celebrating?" she asked, sitting. "Solstice," he said. "Wesley." "The shortest day," he said. "Everything gets longer from here." She looked at him across the table. "That is the most poetic thing you have ever said to me." "Do not get used to it," he said, setting a plate in front of her, and she laughed and they ate and talked and the wine was good, and the candles burned low and outside the Wyoming winter did whatever it chose, and inside the cabin was the warmest place she had ever been. He asked her to marry him on the last day of December, 1874. He asked her at the south fireplace in the evening, which was where she had known he would ask her because that was the architecture of their life together, and he was a man who built things with intention and structural integrity. He did not make a production of it, which she had also known, because he was not a man who made productions. He sat beside her, not across from her, which was different and already significant, and he said, "I told you I was going to be clear." "You did," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want this to be permanent and legal and known. I want you to be my wife and I want to be your husband and I want us to build this place together for the rest of whatever time we get." He paused. "I do not have a ring. I should have thought of a ring. That was an oversight." "It was," she agreed. "I will get one," he said. "In town, or I can write to Denver. They have Wesley," she said. "Yes. Ask me the question," she said. "Will you marry me, Lucy Garner?" "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He exhaled, and she realized he had been genuinely uncertain, which was both touching and slightly ridiculous given the preceding 3 months, and she reached out and took his face in both hands and kissed him, the first time she had kissed him, decisive and real, and he kissed her back with the restrained, ardent sincerity of a man who had been waiting for this and was determined to do it properly. When they separated, both of them were slightly breathless. "The ring," he said. "Write to Denver," she said. "Choose something with a green stone. I prefer green to diamonds." He blinked. "All right. And I want to write to Clara. She is going to be insufferable about being right." "She was right. She told me not to let you get away," Lucy said. "She is going to want credit for the entire thing." He smiled. Outside, the last night of 1874 was dark and cold and absolutely silent. They were married on the 18th of March, 1875, at the church in Millhaven on a day when the worst of the winter had broken, and the first genuine warmth of the year was coming off the mountains, which was not coincidence because Lucy had planned the date with her usual precision, wanting to be married as the land was coming back to life. The whole of Millhaven came, which was 200 people, all of whom had an opinion about this marriage and all of them favorable, even the ones who had never spoken to Lucy directly, because the story of the second fireplace had, through the particular alchemy of small communities, become a local legend. Harriet Keel cried, Elias Morrow gave a very long speech that nobody had asked for. The blacksmith Theo Pryor brought a gift of hand-forged kitchen implements that were both practical and beautiful. Clara Simmons came from St. Louis. Lucy had not told Wesley that Clara was coming, partly because she had not known herself until Clara's letter arrived 6 weeks before, reading in Clara's characteristic style, "I am coming to your wedding, obviously. Frederick says the trip is impractical. I told him to mind his own business. I will be there on the 16th. Lucy had written back, "You are my maid of honor and I love you, and please bring the blue dress, the one with the buttons." Clara arrived on the 15th and spent approximately 45 minutes with Wesley, and then came to Lucy in the kitchen and said, in a low, urgent, deeply satisfied voice, "He is wonderful." "I know," Lucy said. "He is exactly what the letters suggested, but better in person," Clara said. "He has the kind of eyes that make you feel he is actually listening to what you say." "He is," Lucy said. "He actually is." "The fireplace is extraordinary," Clara said. "I walked past it on the way to the kitchen and I had to stop." "I know," Lucy said. "You are very in love with him," Clara said. "I am," Lucy said, and saying it out loud to another person for the first time made it real in a new way, added a dimension to it, and she felt it expand in her chest like something that had been compressed and was finally being given its proper space. "Good," Clara said, with the deep satisfaction of someone who has been right about something important. "Then let us make sure you are married tomorrow before he has any reason to doubt it." They were married. Wesley said his vows with the same direct, careful steadiness that characterized everything he did, looking at her with absolute undivided attention, and Lucy said hers with the quiet conviction of a woman who had thought hard about every word and meant all of them. The minister, a young man named Rourke who had arrived in Millhaven 6 months ago from Ohio, and was still somewhat startled by the territory, performed the ceremony with visible emotion that he would probably deny later. When the minister pronounced them married, there was a sound from the assembled Millhaven community that was part applause and part something more like collective relief, as though a long-running weather pattern had finally resolved, and Wesley looked at Lucy, and she looked at him, and she thought, "This is the most certain I have ever been of anything." He kissed her in front of everyone, brief and private in the way of a man who understood that some things were not for public consumption, and then pulled back and looked at her with that full smile, warm and unguarded and entirely his, and she thought, "There it is. There is the whole of it." Spring came, and with it the kitchen garden. Lucy planted it in April with the methodical pleasure of someone executing a plan they have been refining all winter, and Wesley worked beside her without being asked, turning soil and carrying water, and following her directions without the slightly wounded quality of a man who needs to be the one directing things, which she found she loved, his complete comfort with her authority in the domains where her authority was better founded. The apple trees were ordered from a nursery in Denver, 4 trees, 2 varieties, arriving as bare-root stock in May, and planted along the south-facing slope with a ceremony that was mostly private, but involved Patience the gray mare watching from the paddock with her ears in the cautiously favorable position she had gradually adopted for Lucy-related events. 5 years, Lucy said, patting the earth around the smallest tree. "Minimum," Wesley said. "We will have a crop in 1880, she said. He looked at her and at the slope and at the mountains behind it. "Yes," he said, "we will." Goddard made one more move in the summer of 1875, attempting to redirect the creek that ran through the southwest corner of the property by damming it upstream on his land, which would have deprived Wesley's lower pasture of its water in the dry months. He was perhaps unaware that Lucy had anticipated exactly this possibility in a 3-page letter to the Federal Land Office that had accompanied their original complaint, a letter that had specifically flagged the creek's status as a navigable water source under federal jurisdiction, and requested that any modification to its flow upstream of the Bristol property be subject to federal review. The dam was removed by federal order 6 weeks after it appeared. Goddard did not attempt anything further after that. The federal record was too clean, too complete, and too clearly the work of someone who was thinking 2 moves ahead of him. He sold the Crossbar Ranch to a cattle company based in Denver in 1877 and left the territory. Lucy noted his departure with the satisfaction of a chess player who had seen the end of the game from the middle. "He is gone," Wesley told her, coming in from town with the news. "Good," she said, from her position at the kitchen table where she was writing a letter to Clara, who had her first child by then, a girl named Anna, and who wrote long, vivid, funny letters about the adventure of motherhood that Lucy read with great enjoyment and was beginning to regard with something more than academic interest. "Are you happy?" he asked. Not about Goddard, she understood. About all of it. She put down her pen and looked up at him in the afternoon light of the cabin, which she had made her own now in every way. The colors and the arrangement, and the accumulated presence of 2 years of daily life. The south fireplace, unlit in summer, its hearthstone worn smooth now at the right edge where she always set down her cup. The shelf of books that had grown considerably, the herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling. The wedding photograph on the wall, taken by a traveling photographer who had come through Millhaven, and who had produced an image of the two of them that Wesley claimed made him look severe, and Lucy claimed made her look astonished, and which was, in fact, an excellent photograph of two people who were genuinely happy and slightly overwhelmed by the fact of it. "Yes," she said, "I am very happy." "Good," he said, with the same simplicity he brought to everything important. Their son was born in the spring of 1878, on a morning in April when the mountains were still carrying snow on their upper reaches and the apple trees on the south slope, now 3 years old and growing strongly, were putting out their first delicate flowers. They named him Thomas. He arrived into the world with an opinions about everything energy that Wesley said reminded him of Patience, and Lucy said reminded her of herself. And he was healthy and loud, and possessed of a particular dark-eyed seriousness that appeared at unpredictable intervals between the bouts of ordinary infant chaos and made people stop and look twice. The delivery had been done by Dr. Calloway, who was matter-of-fact and competent, and who told them afterward that everything had gone well and that the baby was strong. Wesley sat beside Lucy in the aftermath with his hand over hers, and she was exhausted and radiant and slightly stunned, and he was also slightly stunned, which was the most shaken she had ever seen him look. A man who had faced down armed men in Dodge City unmoved and was currently sitting beside his wife and newborn son with an expression of complete, overwhelmed wonder. "Thomas," she said, and looked down at the baby and then up at Wesley. He was looking at her, not at the baby, at her, with an expression so unguarded and full that she felt it like a hand on her sternum, pressing gently. "You are extraordinary," he said. "You built a fireplace before you knew I was coming," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him by the non sequitur, and the baby startled at the sound and made a face, and both of them looked at Thomas, and the laugh had broken the overwhelm into something lighter and more manageable, which was, Lucy thought, exactly what it was supposed to do. The years that followed were good years. Not uncomplicated years, because no years are uncomplicated and the territory was still a place where hard things happened. A drought in 1880 that dried the creek to a trickle and tested the ranch severely. A winter storm in 1881 that they came through intact, but that took 3 of their cattle and damaged the barn enough that it needed substantial repair. There were ordinary griefs and losses. Dr. Calloway dying in 1879, Harriet Keel's husband passing the following year, a cold that took November the black mare in the winter of 1882, which affected Lucy more than she had expected it to. But the apple trees bore their first real crop in 1880, as Lucy had planned, and she stood on the south slope in September of that year with Thomas, who was 2 and a half and deeply interested in everything, and picked the first apple from the first tree and bit into it standing in the Wyoming sunlight with the mountains behind her and the ranch spread below, and her husband riding the fence line in the distance, a figure on horseback against the enormous sky. And the apple was tart and cold and absolutely real. She sent one to Clara, wrapped carefully in cloth and paper, with a note that said, "Apple from the tree I planted the year after I arrived. 5 years, as I said. I have enclosed it as evidence that planning works. Tell Anna she may have a bite." Clara's reply came back 6 weeks later. Anna ate the entire apple before I could stop her and declared it the best thing she had ever tasted. Frederick tried one slice and said it was very good, which from Frederick is practically a declaration of love. "I have told everyone in St. Louis about your orchard. They are all extremely jealous. I am not jealous at all. I am only profoundly happy for you. P.S. You should know I take full credit for all of it. P.P.S. I love you." Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, was born in 1882 in November, which meant she and the late mayor shared a birth month, a coincidence that Wesley pointed out with a softness that told her he was still thinking about the horse. And Lucy touched his face and said that Rose and November both had very fine presences, and she was sure the timing was meaningful. Rose was incandescent from the first day, a child of enormous and immediate personality, with Lucy's directness and Wesley's dark eyes, and a laugh that filled rooms in a way that made everyone in them feel more alive. She and Thomas, 4 years apart, were a complete and functional opposition. Thomas methodical, patient, observant; Rose immediate, fearless, thoroughly convinced that every situation could be improved by her personal involvement. They were both given, from the earliest age they could manage, a relationship to the land that was serious and real. Lucy believed, with deep conviction, that children understood the value of something in proportion to the work they had put into it, and so both Thomas and Rose had their own sections of the kitchen garden by the time they could use a trowel, and their own relationships with the horses, and their own ways of learning the land that were particular to them. Thomas loved the early mornings like his father. Rose loved the late afternoons, which was when the light on the mountains did its most dramatic work, and she would stand on the ridge and watch it with an expression of absolute satisfaction. The south fireplace had become something else over the years. It was still theirs, still the evening fireplace, still the one they sat beside for the long conversations and the reading and the quiet. But it had accumulated layers of meaning in the way that the central objects of a life do, had become the place where they had weathered the drought of 1880 with the careful rationing of winter supplies, where they had sat after Harriet Keel's husband's funeral and talked about the particular geography of grief, where they had read the letter from the Denver Land Company, confirming that the expansion of the orchard to 12 trees was going ahead as planned. Thomas, at 6, asked his father one evening who had built the south fireplace. Wesley looked at Lucy across the room. "Your mother arrived," Wesley said, "and the house needed to be half hers before she walked in, so I built it before she got here." Thomas considered this. "Before she said she was coming, before she agreed to anything at all," Wesley said. Thomas considered further. "That seems like a risk," he said, with the gravity of a 6-year-old who had a very developed relationship with the concept of risk assessment. "It was," Wesley said. "It was the best one I ever took." Lucy, from across the room, said nothing, but looked at her husband with an expression that was 11 years of daily life and 2 children and 1 orchard, and a legally secured water right and 22 letters, and a gray mare named Patience, and a federal land commissioner named Aldgate, and a last day of 1874 by this very fire. All of it accumulated in a look that he received across the cabin and returned in kind. "Papa," Rose said from her position on the floor where she was engaged with a piece of charcoal and a piece of paper in what she described as a map of the entire ranch. "Yes. Is the south fireplace Mama's? It is yours to share," Wesley said. "The whole house is." "But she built it first," Thomas said. "You did," For her. He did, Lucy said from across the room. He built it before he knew for certain that I would ever see it. Rose looked at the south fireplace with the evaluating expression of someone deciding whether a thing is adequately legendary. She apparently decided that it was, because she went back to her map with the satisfied air of someone who has confirmed something important. In the spring of 1885, on the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Wesley came in from the orchard with an apple blossom in his hand, which was early in the season, but the south slope caught the warmth first, and the nearest tree was always ahead of the others. He put it down on the table beside Lucy's coffee cup without saying anything. She looked at it. She looked at him. She thought of the fireplace, of the letter that had said come and see, of the train from St. Louis and the cold October wind at her back, of asking who it was for and hearing the answer that had told her everything. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said, and sat down beside her, which was where he had always sat, close and deliberate, with no performance and no distance. She put her hand in his. His hands were larger and more weathered than they had been 10 years ago, and she knew every callus and scar on them the way she knew every fence line and water course on the ranch, the way she knew every expression in his face, every quality of his silence, every version of his smile. "Are you happy?" she asked, using his own question back at him. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been reading for a decade now, that were as clear to her as text in her own handwriting. "Every day," he said. "Every single day." Outside, the apple trees were blooming on the south slope, white and delicate against the blue Wyoming sky. Thomas was somewhere on the east fence line doing his methodical morning inspection of a section he had claimed as his own responsibility at the age of 8, and maintained with a seriousness that made his father quietly, privately proud. Rose was in the paddock talking to the horses with the authority of someone who had inherited Patience's tendency to have opinions and was not shy about communicating them. The mountains stood as they had always stood, enormous and blue and permanent, the fixed coordinates against which all other things found their position. The south fireplace was cold this morning, not needed in the April warmth. It would be lit again tonight, as it always was, as it had been for 10 years, as it would be for all the years that followed, burning cedar and warmth into a cabin that had been built for one man, and had been built, in the second half of its architecture, for the woman who might come, who had stepped through the door on the 4th of October 1874, and asked who the second fireplace was for, and who had stayed when she heard the answer, and had never once considered leaving again. Lucy picked up the apple blossom from beside her cup and held it carefully, the way you hold things that are both small and enormous, and she thought about planning, about 5-year plans and 10-year plans and the long, slow work of building a life that was actually hers, and she thought that the truest thing she had ever discovered was this, that the things worth having do not arrive whole. They are built, one stone at a time, by people who have decided to commit before they know how it turns out. They are built by people who trust the work. She had been trusted before she agreed to come. She had trusted back before she agreed to stay. Everything that mattered had grown from that exchange. "The trees are blooming early," she said. "South Slope catches the warmth," he said. "I know," she said. "I planned it that way." He smiled and she smiled, and the morning came on in gold and clear air over the Laramie Mountains, and the ranch was alive with the particular, daily, irreplaceable life that two people make together when they have each chosen the other with their full attention and their full intention and have not stopped choosing, every day, every year, for as long as they are given. Thomas came in at mid-morning, dusty and satisfied from his fence inspection, with news that the lower pasture grass was coming in thick, and the creek was running clear and full, good signs all of them. The language of the land saying what it always said when the year was turning right. That the hard work of winter was over, and the long work of summer was beginning, and the people who knew how to read the land could hear, in all of it, the particular promise of another good year. Rose came in behind him, having apparently finished whatever diplomatic mission she had been conducting in the paddock, and announced that the newest horse, a young sorrel gelding they had acquired the previous autumn and had not yet named to everyone's satisfaction, had this morning made clear his preference to be called something with dignity, and that she had therefore decided on the name Chancellor, which she felt conveyed both dignity and a certain authority. "Chancellor," Lucy said. "Yes," Rose said. "He will need to grow into it," Wesley said. "He will," Rose said serenely. "I told him so." It was an ordinary morning on the ranch. It was the best morning of Lucy Garner Bristol's life, because it was one of the 10,000 ordinary mornings that made up the life she had been offered on a cold October evening and had chosen with her whole heart, and every one of them was the best. Every one was the one she would have chosen again. She set the apple blossom in a glass of water on the windowsill above the south fireplace. When she lit the fire that evening, the blossom was still there, white against the darkening window, the mountains going dark behind it. The fire took, and the warmth spread through the cabin, and the family gathered in its light as they had every evening for 10 years, and the story that had begun with a fireplace built before she had agreed to come continued in the way that good stories do. Not with an ending, but with the particular, luminous permanence of people who have found each other truly and chosen each other freely, and are building together something that will outlast the building. This was enough. This was everything. This was the life, hers and his and theirs, burning steady on the south wall of a cabin in the Wyoming Territory in the autumn of a year that was going to be as good as the one before it, and the one before that, and all the years that came before and after, in the long, warm, irreplaceable light of a fire that had been lit for her before she had agreed to come. She had asked who it was for. She knew the answer now in every bone and stone of her. It had always been for this.